welcome on board the Terence G. My name's Pete Morgan, and this is the start of the Grain Run, Britain's ancient water highway. We always think of the Romans travelling by road, never imagine them travelling by water. But the Grain Run follows the Roman route, follows the way they carried the grain up to their garrisons in the north. Right now we're in the Wash, just off the coast of Lincolnshire, and this is the start of our voyage. The scenery of the Grain Run has shifted considerably since the Roman occupation of Britain, and if the Romans were to come back now, they wouldn't know the place. We're heading into the haven, the sheltered mouth of the River Witham, and in Roman times, this cut between the high green banks on either side wouldn't have been here at all. In Roman times, all this was open sea.
Despite all the 20th century redevelopment, there's still a lot of the old town left, and it's well worth looking at. Some of the redevelopment preserves the exterior. A former grain warehouse becomes a music centre. Blackfriars, the 13th century Dominican priory, is now a theatre. Fidel House remains one of the finest 18th century houses in England. The Guildhall is now a museum. This fine building of Dutch brick was built in 1450.
It wasn't until 150 years later that Boston Guildhall really passed into contemporary history. It was in 1630 that a group who sought religious freedom attempted to leave England. They were arrested in Boston, brought to this courtroom, where they were detained and led down here. These steps lead to the cells where the group who later became known as the Pilgrim Fathers were incarcerated. It's amazing to think that 7 men were kept in 2 cells the size of this one while awaiting their trial at Lincoln Assizes.
Is the Sarah Whitby, our craft for the next 40 miles or so from here on till the River Trent. But of course, we haven't finished with Boston yet. There's a lot more to see here by water than you might think. You won't find too many locks on the Grain Run, but this one at Anton's Gout takes us off the natural watercourse and onto an intricate system of man-made waterways. They weren't designed so much for the passage of boats as for land reclamation and the prevention of flood. Their rather unromantic name suggests their use. Through that gate behind me are the Witham navigable drains.
And that's it. Now it's gone quiet and peaceful. We're back under the same power that they always had in the olden days. All they had was wind and tide.
You can put 3 adjectives to this land. It's flat, it's alluvial, and it's reclaimed. Its major crop is still, you guessed it, grain. Eric Dring has farmed this area of Lincolnshire for the last 40 years. Eric, hello. Thanks very much for bringing a cargo for us to take on our rerun of the Grain Run. Is this as a result of your own crop?
Now, for the first time, the distant towers of Cathedral City can be seen on the horizon. The guillotine of Stamp End Lock divides far more than one stretch of water from the other. It cuts between the work of nature and the hand of man. Despite such 20th century necessities as parking bays and bottle banks, multiple stores and gents' urinals, this final stretch of the Witham is one of the best preserved stretches of urban waterway in Britain.
This has got to be one of the finest sights on the Grain Run, probably one of the finest sights on the waterways of the world. This is the Glory Hole, one of the oldest bridges in England, built in medieval times on the foundations of a Norman bridge. What makes the Glory Hole unique is the 4-story block of timbered buildings perching on the western side. When we passed through the bridge, the middle of the bridge was just 9 foot 9 above the water. It's difficult to imagine that Lincoln's High Street passed above our heads. Thanks to nature, it was simple enough for the Romans to get the grain from the fens right to the heart of Lincoln. All they did was they shipped it up the Witham and into the Brayford Pool. But they wanted to get it further north. They wanted it in York. The Roman solution was to build a canal. And this is it, the Fosdyke, cut by the Romans in AD 120 to link the Witham with the Trent. Hello. My name's Pete Morgan and I'm your guide on the grain run. We're following Britain's ancient water highway, the way the Romans carried the grain north from the fens of Lincolnshire. Right now we're in the Fosdyke, the oldest canal in Britain that's still in navigable condition. When you look at it now, it's difficult to imagine that this waterway was cut by the Romans in AD 120. We're 23 feet from stem to stern. It's reckoned that some of the great Roman barges which used to ply this water measured over 100 feet, 4 times the length of our craft, the Sarah Whitby.
It's at Torksey Lock that I test my footing on dry land.
Lovely. Got it. Thank you. Alan, thanks very much. That was a great trip, mate.
Have a good journey.
Thank you.
They're very pleasant.
Hundreds, thousands of fragments of Romano-British pottery were found where the Fosdyke cuts into the Trent.
Once we've passed through Torksey Lock, we're back on tidal waters for the first time since we left Boston 45 miles ago. The Whittaker's tanker, Humber Dawn, is an impressive vessel. She's 149 feet from stem to stern, 2 main engines, 300 horsepower, and when loaded, she's capable of carrying 470 tons of bulk liquid. It'd take 20 road tankers to ship that lot between them.
The Trent is an impressive river, navigable for almost 100 miles.
Looking at West Stockwith today, it's difficult to imagine that this small community was once a busy inland port, but it was, thanks largely to the work of James Brindley, the 18th century canal architect, who wanted to get the lead and coal out of Derbyshire and onto the path of the grain run.
Originally, the old hall was built in the 15th century as a residence. Since then, it's been a soup kitchen, a theatre, a public house, a dance hall. More predictably, a corn exchange. But perhaps the old hall's greatest claim to fame is that this is where Henry VIII, fat and middle-aged and lonely, first met Catherine Parr.
Dawn, there's 300 horsepower beneath the hatch to see her off for a very different cargo from that which the Trent once carried when Emperor Hadrian built his wall.
Grain from the fens, all the way to York. A journey of over 100 miles with only the wind and the tide for power. It makes you wonder how the Romans did it. Hello and welcome. I'm Pete Morgan. On the last 3 legs of our voyage, we've followed the grain run, followed the way the Romans took to carry the grain from south to north. But so far on our journey, we've taken the easy way. We've used power where the Romans relied on nature. All they had was wind and tide. Now, it's the same with us for a while.
After the Abbey, Selby's most famous landmark has to be the bridge. It doesn't look much, and it's not. To motorists, it's probably the most notorious, most infamous bottleneck in Britain. It's privately rewarding to achieve the Selby Toll Bridge experience from the other side of the tracks, sliding backwards, gently through without the flush of bemused frustration, fingers drumming on the steering wheel. At one time, the Selby Toll Bridge was manually operated, an even greater bottleneck then than now. Now hydraulics do the work. For almost 200 years, since the Selby Bridge Act of 1791, there's been a concession to local drivers and all pedestrians. It's visitors and vehicles who pay their way, 5p a ton to cross the bridge above the waters of the present-day grain run.
Of course, none of this would be known to the Romans. At the time they ran their grain run, these shores would be thick with forest, and there wasn't one bridge across the Ouse. There weren't any towns either. The concept of townships was brought by the Romans, just as they brought the roads to Britain, just as they cut the first canal. On the final leg of our voyage, we'll be boarding different craft as the river narrows.